Okay, now to start with the actual talk. In a sense, the theme, Zionism, colonial wars, is this virtually identical to the history of the Zionist project. The history of the Zionist project is, in some sense, a history of its wars. It's a little bit reductionist, but not to a great extent, to describe the Zionist project as armed robbery of Palestinian land. That's what it amounts to in great measure. In fact, this was very clearly announced in a seminal document, which I quote in several of my articles that you find in Weekly Worker and elsewhere. I mean the famous article by Vladimir Jabotinsky entitled "The Iron Wall." It's a very Jabotinsky was a very influential Zionist leader. He is actually the forefather of a whole section of Zionism. That is to say, the section that is not self-described socialist Zionism, if you like, right-wing Zionism, which is now has been in power in Israel for many years, for the bigger part of its history since 1948. I mean, initially in the beginning, in the first 20 years of its existence, labor Zionism was dominant, but since then, increasingly labor Zionism has been marginalized, almost disappeared, whereas the so-called right-wing Zionism, which of which Jabotinsky was a founding father, has been in charge. In this seminal article, The Iron Wall, written in 1923, Jabotinsky says very clearly that Zionism can only win by use of armed force. Don't have any illusions. In this sense, it's a very prescient article. He says, look, this is a project of colonization. He uses the word colonization quite freely. The article was, by the way, written in Russian, and the Russian word that he uses is colonization. So you can see that this is directly translated into English colonization. It says this, what we are doing in Palestine is colonization, and there is no precedent of colonization taking place without the indigenous population, the natives, resisting it. You can only overcome their resistance by force. And this has been the case. In this sense, this article was very frank and also prescient. But in another respect, the article is grossly unrealistic. He doesn't say so directly, but you get the impression from reading the article that this process of overcoming native resistance is going to be more or less quick. It's going to be a rapid process. It isn't something that is going to last 100 years, as it has done. And he, being a sort of bourgeois liberal, he says, you know, once we overcome the resistance of the natives and we, the Zionist colonizers, will become the majority, will establish a Jewish majority in Palestine. And by this, he actually meant not just Palestine as it was under the British mandate, but also including what is today the Kingdom of Jordan. So Palestine, as it was described then before, Churchill divided it into Transjordanian Palestine, which became Transjordan, which is now the Kingdom of Jordan, and Palestine as it was under the British mandate and is today under Israeli rule. We become a majority, and then we will give the indigenous people equal individual rights. There will be a liberal country with individual rights for all, but without any national rights. Of course, it will be a majority Jewish country, and that's it. Well, it didn't, and by the way, also typical of his conception was, and in this he was prescient, was that the exercise of force would be done by, I mean, the force that will be applied will be the force of the British Empire. That is to say, the Britain, which is committed to the Zionist project via the Balfour Declaration, will actually be the force of course. It will mean that the Zionist movement should also be involved as part of this force. But a major part of this force, this is the impression that he gives clearly if you read the article, and it's an article which is worth reading. By the way, I've made a translation of it, which is, in my opinion, the best, because it corrects various mistakes that were made in the previous translation. I've put a link to the translation that I made from the original Russian. Okay, now, what is the reason that he was so grossly mistaken as far as the question how long it will take? It has taken 100 years. I mean, since that article was written, there are 99 years, and it doesn't seem like there is an end to the use of force to establish Zionist colonization in sight. This is going on. Well, I think the reason why it has been so long and why Israel has been involved in a whole series of wars, some of which are famous and you know about, some of which you've never heard of, but they were real wars, some forgotten wars. I'll mention one or two. This is because of the nature of the Zionist colonization project, which is in a sense unique. I've written an analysis of the uniqueness of the Zionist colonizing project. It is an article that was published in the Weekly Worker of 23rd of June 2016, under the title The Decolonization of Palestine. I explained there that the Zionist colonization project is unique in several respects, and the most important of which is you have to compare it with not with completely different styles of colonization, what Kautsky called exploitation colonies, or what Marx called plunder colonies, like the British colonial presence in India, or the colonization of Mexico, where it was a question of the colonizer just plundering the country using the labor force of the indigenous population. No, Zionism belongs to a different style of colonization, what Kautsky called work colonies, and what Marx called colonization, properly so-called, where the settlers used their own labor power, not relying on the labor power of the indigenous people, but the direct producers are some of the colonizers themselves. This occurred in North America, in Australia, in New Zealand, and in Palestine. The difference was that according to a very perceptive analysis by Kautsky, which I quote in that article, the colonizers very soon overwhelmed the indigenous population. Those countries that I mentioned, Australia, North America, were sparsely populated by people whose mode of production was tribal or pre-capitalist in a very distinctive sense. It was quite easy for the settlers, relatively speaking, to overwhelm numerically the indigenous people. The case of Palestine was very different in many respects. It was not one of the countries which apparently was suitable for this style of colonization. It was chosen for political and ideological reasons by the Zionist movement for colonizing. It was densely populated, not by a pre-capitalist tribal society or that kind of thing, but by an early modern population with a high degree of urbanization and so on. So the numerical ratio between settlers and indigenous people was quite different in Palestine than in all comparable colonies like North America, like New Zealand, like Australia. And this produced a lasting situation of, if you like, stalemate. Unlike the plunder colonies, like Britain's colonies in Africa, where the settlers were a very small minority and those countries were, for the most part, decolonized in the second half of the 20th century. And unlike the other colonies which relied on the settlers' labor power, like North America and Australia, where the indigenous population was overwhelmed by settlers, in some places exterminated. Tasmania is an example of this, but in other countries, overwhelmed, the indigenous population was overwhelmed by settlers. In the case of Palestine, you have a numerical, more or less, stalemate. The settlers are immeasurably more powerful in the military sense, but numerically there is a situation of stalemate. In fact, at present, the population of the territory under Israeli Zionist control has a marginal majority of indigenous people. There are more Palestinian Arabs in the whole area between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea than there are members of the Jewish settler community. So this has resulted in a situation where the conflict has not been resolved, neither as it was in the case of African colonies in the sense of decolonization, nor as it has been resolved in favor of the settlers as it has been in Australia, etc. So this is a situation of a long-lasting series of wars of colonization. And they have various forms. I will enumerate list of Israel's war. I mean, you can find it in some sources, a list of the wars that Israel has been involved in. And I'm starting more or less arbitrarily with the first war in which Israel was involved, excluding the wars of Zionist colonization before the creation of the State of Israel, because there have been pre-Israel Zionist wars of colonization. I'll mention one of these later on. So first of all, there was the War of the Nakba, 1947-49. Then during the 1950s, Israel was involved in low-level guerrilla counterinsurgency against Fedayeen, incursion of Palestinians who were, some of whom were just coming to reap the fields that they abandoned, forcibly had to be abandoned in the war. Some of these were guerrilla operations, very ineffectual, but it's listed in the war. Then there is 1956, the Suez War, about which I will say some more in the sequel. There was the June War of 1967. You've heard of this. This is a major war. Then I don't suppose many of you have heard of the War of Attrition, which took place between 1967 and 1970. This is quite important in Israeli history. Israel was involved in a static war along the Suez Canal between Israeli forces and Egypt. Exchange of fire and small-scale incursions from both sides. It was a war of attrition. It ended inconclusively. Then there's the affair of Black September 1970. Between 1971 and 82, there was Palestinian insurgency coming from South Lebanon, where Palestinian forces have been exiled from Jordan, where they were stationed until the Black September of 1970. Then in 1982, there was the first Lebanon War. Israel occupied the south of Lebanon, initially reaching as far as Beirut, but then occupying for many years the south of Lebanon. And that took place, that was held by Israel. The whole of South Lebanon was held by Israel until the year 2000. Then there was the first Intifada of 1987-1993. Then the second Intifada, 2000 to 2005. Then there was the second Lebanese war. Israel invaded Lebanon in 2006. Then there were a series of Israeli wars, more or less unilateral wars against Gaza. 2008, 2009. I think I've skipped the Yom Kippur War of 1973, which of course is well known. A series of wars against Gaza, 2006, 2008-9, 2012, 2014, and 2021, and the recent 5 days war against Gaza, which just ended a few days ago. So you see the whole series, an almost endless state of war. What is typical of this, and also is already clear from Jabotinsky's seminal article, which I mentioned, is that a lot of this armed conflict is connected with Israel's role as an ally of imperialism. To be precise, whichever imperialist power is dominant in the area. The relationship between Israel and its imperial sponsors has been misrepresented in two quite opposite ways, both of which are gross exaggerations in one direction or the other. Let me find this in the notes. Okay. One exaggerated representation of this relationship is very common nowadays, and I have abbreviated it as ITWAD, Israel tail wags American dog. It is as if Israel has control over American imperial policy in the Middle East, which is acting in Israel's interests rather than its own. In other words, the relationship is misrepresented as Israel being the dominant partner and the United States, the present imperial boss, as in fact a tool of Zionism. I've argued against this. This is a gross misrepresentation of the true situation. In former days, you had the opposite kind of misrepresentation. I can remember very clearly at times, and you have some of it emerging from time to time, even in today, in which Israel is represented as mere tool of imperialism. That is to say, the whole Zionist project is not something genuine. It is an invention, a trick, if you like, an instrument of imperialism, originally of British imperialism. It was implanted in the Middle East in order to serve British interests at the time. Then Britain was expelled as an imperial boss in this area and replaced by the United States. And now Israel is a mere instrument of American imperialism. This is equally a misrepresentation of the true situation. In fact, Israel is, if you like, a partner of imperialism in the area. It has been a partner, it is a partner, and the conflict will continue so long as this partnership persists. I'm going to illustrate this instead of going on in generalities as I have done until now. I'm going to concentrate on two of the conflicts, two of the items, one of which is the Suez War, and the other is military or armed conflict, which predates the formation of Israel, and that is the suppression of the Palestinian uprising of the mid-1930s. I've chosen these for various reasons. They are typical in the sense that they bring out the mutual relationship between Israel and its imperialist sponsor, if you like. And in both cases, there is Britain played an important role. in the 1966 case, 36 case, Britain was still the dominant empire ruling the Middle East. The Suez War of 1956 marked, if you like, the thumping end of Britain's pretensions to be an independent imperialist force in the world. This was, if you like, the end of British imperialism in the sense of being an independent or having pretensions, at least, to be a force in its own right. Okay, let me start with the 1930s. You know, there are 3 Britons that are venerated in the present-day Israel. 3. 2 of which I think most people have heard of. Certainly you have heard of Balfour. And you can realize why Balfour is venerated by the present-day Israel. That is due to the Balfour Declaration, in which constituted a British charter for the Zionist colonization of Palestine. Okay, that was Lord Balfour. The second Briton who is venerated, I mean, there are main streets in Israeli cities named after Balfour. There are also main streets in Israel named after Allenby. Who was Allenby? I mean, the main street in Old Tel Aviv is Allenby Street. I grew up around the corner from Allenby Street in Tel Aviv. Who was Allenby? Allenby was the general at the head of the British force that liberated Palestine in the First World War. Okay, so he as it were, was at the head of the armed force that actually made way for the implementation of the Balfour Declaration. I don't think many people that in the audience have heard of the third Briton who is venerated in Israel. His name is Wingate, Ord Wingate. Who was Ord Wingate? I recommend that you read the Wikipedia entry on Ord Wingate. In a nutshell, he was a military genius and a nutcase. I mean, this is not my description. I mean, various British authors describe him as unbalanced, more than slightly mad. When he was in Palestine, he was a captain. He later became a general. He had a great career in various parts of the British Empire. He started his military career, I think, in Sudan, under the British occupation of Sudan. Then in Palestine, about which I will say a few words, his role in Palestine. Then in Ethiopia, and he ended up in Burma. And his role, I think he is, as it were, the founder of the strategy which is used still by British commando units such as the SIS. He developed a method of fighting insurgency which used commando methods which, when used by the other side, is called terrorism. In fact, a ruthless and criminal, in the sense of war crimes, treatment of insurgent population in various parts of the British Empire. He developed the tactics. In this sense, his influence is still extant in the way British commando units fight today. Not very nice. Tom Segev, the Israeli historian, has qualified him as a war criminal. He is very venerated in Israel for the reason that, well, let me read a few excerpts from his entry in Wikipedia. He became politically involved with a number of Zionist leaders. He was stationed in Palestine in the mid-30s and became an ardent Zionist himself. He always returned to Kibbutz Harod because he felt familiar with the biblical judge of Gideon, who fought in this area and used it himself as a military base. He formulated the idea of raising small assault units of British-led Jewish commandos armed with grenades and light infantry, small arms, to combat the Arab revolt. He took his idea personally, and this was his project. He had to get permission from his superior officer. The superior officer was Archibald Wavell, who was commander of British forces in that part of the world. He got his permission, and he, at the same time, had to convince the Zionist movement to allow him to apply his method using committed Zionist fighters. He established what became known, what was called then as the Special Night Squads. He operated at night, deep incursions into Arab Palestinian villages and creating havoc, actually using very cruel and criminal, in the sense of war crime methods, in order to suppress the rebellion. Among the core members and associated members of the Special Night Squads were most of the leading senior officers in what became in a while, within 12 years, the Israeli army. So people you have heard of, like Moshé Dayan, Igal Alon, some of you may have heard of, were all associated with Wingate and learned their first, got their first military training under him. His influence, his lasting influence on Israeli fighting methods is absolutely unrivaled. And it is not for nothing that he is venerated in Israel. There are various institutions, various establishments named after him. The question that I want to raise, what was the relationship between the Zionist movement and the British Empire in this venture? Was it the British Empire soliciting the participation of Zionist fighters in order to quell rebellion against Britain, which was also a rebellion against Zionist colonization? Or was it the other way around? Was it Zionism that solicited the British Empire in order to carry out a common venture? Well, it was a bit of both. Wingate was a soldier of the empire. But before he actually thought of his project, he first became a Christian Zionist. So it was a sort of, if you like, a synergy or a symbiosis of Zionist activism and British imperial interest that led to this venture, which I repeat is seminal in Israeli military doctrine. It was the special night squads were one of the roots of the Israeli military force, so-called IDF, Israeli Defense Force. That is unquestionable. And also, by the way, the main institute in Israel of physical education is named after Wingate. It's the Wingate Institute. Okay, so this is 1936. Okay, I now want to jump 20 years ahead to the Suez War to illustrate this symbiosis or relationship between imperialism and Zionist military rule. I'm sure you all know about the Suez War, but I'm not sure that you know what actually led to it. You know that it happened in 1956. There was an invasion started by Israel in October 1956, followed by previous arrangement, as it turned out, by Britain and France. Israel got to the Suez Canal very quickly through parachuting units in the vicinity of the Suez Canal, followed by a heavy invasion of British and French forces. It all ended within a short time because the invaders, the conspirators, as it turned out, the three countries involved in this conspiracy, Israel, France, and Britain, forgot, as it were, to get permission from the real boss, from the United States. They hadn't even bothered to notify the United States what they were doing, and therefore, the United States, this was under the presidency of Eisenhower, very quickly told them to go back to end the invasion of Egypt, and that seemed like a great Egyptian victory, except that this was an illusion. I mean, the only reason that Egypt got out well out of the conflict was not because it displayed military competence against the invasion, but because the United States, in concert with the Soviet Union, compelled the invaders to withdraw. Let me say a few more words how the war went on. Two Israeli paratrooper platoons made up of approximately 50 soldiers stormed. Okay, no, let me go back a little bit. I mean, this is what happened, which is known as it were generally. I'm sure that most of you know about this part of the story. What is interesting is how it all started, how the Suez crisis, which led to the Suez War of 1956, started. And for this, you have to go back more than 1 year to the beginning of 1955. Looking at the audience, at least those present here are in no way can remember these events from their personal memory. I can. I was 20 when the Suez War happened, and I followed it as a young adult, politically aware. let me describe the chain of events. And the chain of events is interesting because it is a combination of steps taken by Israel for its own reasons and for its own purposes, and the imperial forces that were involved. Something rather unexpected happened on the 28th of February, 1955. There was an unprecedented big attack by Israeli paratroop forces against an Egyptian camp in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip was then until 1956 and then again until 1967 under Egyptian rule. Not annexed to Egypt, but ruled by the Egyptians. About 50 Israeli paratroopers stormed an Egyptian army camp in Gaza as an alleged reprisal for continued Fedayeen, Palestinian militant attacks against Israeli civilians. 8 Israeli paratroopers and 39 Egyptian soldiers were killed in the raid, and another 30 Egyptian soldiers were wounded. This came as a surprise, and I remember it was a surprise for me hearing about this raid, because for the most part, Israeli tension, border tension in the preceding months was between Israel and Jordan, not between Israel and Egypt along the Gaza Strip. What led to it? What really caused, what drove Israel to make this unexpected and surprising and rather shocking attack on an Egyptian camp in the Gaza Strip, which was completely unprepared for it? Well, if you go back a few days earlier, 4 days before the attack, something happened in the Middle East, and that is the creation of the promulgation or the conclusion of the Baghdad Pact. The Baghdad Pact, later known as METO or CENTO, was supposed to be a sort of extension of NATO to the area of the Middle East. The signatories of this pact did not include the United States, which created, in fact, or sponsored this pact, but preferred to work, as it were, at one remove. The signatories were Iran under the Shah, of course, Iraq, which was then still a monarchy, excuse me, Turkey, and Pakistan, and the United Kingdom. Okay, so this was supposed to be an extension of NATO, and you know what NATO is for. NATO is basically an instrument for projecting American imperial dominion to various parts of the globe. So this was a sort of an extension of NATO to the Middle East. What was missing is participation of the most important Arab country. The most important Arab country by far is Egypt. So the sponsors of the Baghdad Pact went to Nasser, who was then relatively newly installed as the revolutionary nationalist president of Egypt following the 1953 Young Officers Revolution, and said, would you like to join the Baghdad Pact, or what became CENTO? And he said, no, why should I? I'm not threatened by the Soviet Union. I prefer a policy of neutrality. Aha. Then came the Israeli incursion 4 days later. And it was broadly interpreted, and I think correctly, as a sort of warning. You don't join the Baghdad Pact, we'll set the Israeli military forces against you. True enough, after the Israeli incursion of the 28th of February 1955, Nasser went to the appealed to the United States to be provided with arms to defend Egypt against Israeli attacks. In fact, in my view, and I'm not the only one with this view, I mean, the part of the purpose of the Israeli attack on the 28th of February 55 was precisely to send Egypt to the United States to ask for arms and to get the reply, yes, we'll give you arms. And by the way, since 1950, there was an agreement, the so-called tripartite agreement between Britain, the United States, and France as to provision of arms to various countries in the Middle East. They divided between themselves the provision of arms to various countries of the Middle East. By the way, Israel came under France. It got its arms from France at that time. Okay, so you were attacked by Israel. Nasser turned to the United States, give me some arms to defend myself. I said, all right, if you join the Baghdad Pact, you'll get arms. No way, he said. And then he did something a little bit unexpected. He turned to the Soviet Union and asked for arms from the Soviet Union. And he got arms not from the Soviet Union, but from the way it was arranged, it was from Czechoslovakia that he got quite a lot of arms. Aha! You go in this direction. You go to the Soviet Union to get arms. Will stop a deal that was agreed before. And the deal that was agreed before was American finance for building the Aswan Dam. Aswan Dam was a great project, one of the most important dams. Its environmental influence is questionable, but I don't want to go into it. It was a highly important project for Egypt in order to gain the electric energy needed for development of Egypt. It was a vital project for Egyptian development. So if you don't want to join the Baghdad Pact, you won't get arms, and we won't finance the Aswan Dam. Okay, so he turned to the Soviet Union, and he got finance from the Soviet Union to, but not sufficient. I mean, Soviet Union couldn't actually replace the finance that he got from the West. And then he said, all right, if you don't give me finance, then I know where I can get finance. I nationalized the Suez Canal. Suez Canal was under British and French ownership, and it was a source of revenue, because you charge, ships have to pay tolls for crossing the canal. So we said, yeah, I know how I can get arms, how I can get finance. I will nationalize the Suez Canal, and Egypt will get the tolls from the Suez Canal. And this is what he did on the 26th of July, 1956. And from there started the immediate preparations, which culminated in the invasion of October 56. There was a secret meeting in Sèvres near Paris, initiated by France, in which the whole thing was hatched up. A fascinating account of this plot against Egypt was written by Avi Shleim. It's the Protocol of Sèvres, 1956, Anatomy of a War Plot, an article by Avi Shleim in International Affairs, published in 1997. I'll comment about this in a moment. Shleim rightly says that this is one of the few cases in which evidence of what became a secret plot, what was a secret plot became publicly known. And this was more or less by accident. The parties that hatched the plot a few days before the invasion started at a meeting in a Paris suburb of Sèvres. That was on the 24th of October, 1956. They hatched this plot, which was the idea of a French general called Charles, that Israel would send forces to the Suez Canal, and Britain and France will come in, as it were, to separate the forces in order to, as peacemakers, as it were. And this would be a cover for a British and French invasion of the Suez Canal, annulling its nationalization by Egypt. So this was a plot hatched by them. They signed the protocol finalizing this deal, which had 3 copies. One went to Britain, to Anthony Eden, who was then Prime Minister. The second went to Guy Mollet, who was the French Prime Minister. And the third went to Ben Gurion, who was Israeli Prime Minister, all of whom were, Eden was not present. There was a British Foreign Minister, Selwyn Lloyd, was there. But Ben Gurion was present, and each one had a copy of this plan of a plot. They were committed to destroying the text, which Eden did. Eden, once he got the copy from his foreign minister, looked at it and burned it. The French copy got lost somehow. Ben Gurion kept his copy of the agreement in his archive, and it was released in 1996. That is to say, 40 years later. And Avi Shleim cleverly found the document and published the details of the agreement in his article, which I recommend. This is an enormously instructive and enjoyable article to read, because it is a history of a plot. Of course, it all ended badly for Britain and France. It made clear to them that they cannot take independent steps, independent of the United States in the Middle East. They are no longer empires that can act independently. Israel also got rebuffed. It had to withdraw from its conquests. I mean, days after the invasion, Ben Gurion declared the third kingdom of Israel. In glowing terms. He had to eat his words a few days later, but Israel got quite a prize out of this war. And that is part of the agreement, the secret agreement concluded in Sèvres, was that Israel would get the facilities to produce nuclear weapons given by France. So France, in exchange for Israel's role in this sordid deal, gave Israel the know-how and the material for building the nuclear establishment in Dimona in Israel, which is Israel's undeclared nuclear facility. So Israel became a nuclear power as a result, as a prize for its sordid role in the Suez War of 1956. I've gone into these details in order to show the intricate connections between what Israel did. Of course, Israel had its own reason for attacking Egypt. And the reason was that for the first time, an important Arab country was ruled by a non-corrupt regime. I mean, Nasser was not a socialist, was not in any way one of us, as it were, but he was a decent, honest, and secular leader of the most important Arab countries. And all the Arab masses around the area looked up to him as a way of liberating from the remnant yoke of colonialism. This, of course, Israel regarded as highly dangerous and was interested in fighting it. France, of course, had its involvement in Algeria and thought that Nasser's Egypt was behind this rebellion. It wasn't something authentic. It wouldn't be possible for the Algerian masses to rebel against France without Egyptian help. It's true that Egypt did help the Algerian rebellion, but it was a delusion, a colonialist delusion of France that by attacking Egypt, they could win the Algerian war. They didn't. And Israel has its own reason. Britain wanted to preserve its last foothold as an imperial power in the Middle East, which the Suez Canal represented, and it failed. The only country that got something out of it was Israel. I think this has many lessons to teach us, and I've spoken for an hour now. I'll simply stop here.